Okay, welcome back to the lecture on pictorial space and perspective for Unit 7. When we were last talking, we were talking about one-point perspective. And so this may surprise you, but one-point perspective is called that because there's a single vanishing point, just one point, and then all diagonal lines go to that one vanishing point. And so that essentially the way you do a drawing is you make all your lines either perfectly vertical or perfectly horizontal, and anywhere that there's a corner, and then you have to figure out a diagonal based off of that corner. That diagonal has to be from a point to the vanishing point, whatever your point is, right? So everything is from a point to the vanishing point, from a point to the vanishing point, and there's only one vanishing point. And you can see that same system here, and even in here, in this chaos of all those arms laid down on the ground. So a one-point perspective has one vanishing point. It'll also have a line in the back that'll be called your eye level line. Sometimes people call that the horizon line, but that's a little bit of a misnomer because your horizon line and your eye level line can be different. Sometimes can be quite different depending on the type of perspective illusion you're trying to create. So you have an eye level line. Your vanishing point has to be on your eye level line. Then you have these lines here. They're called vanishing lines, right? And then everything else has to be either perfect vertical, perfect horizontal, and then all these diagonals are vanishing lines. They all have to go to the vanishing point. A two-point perspective system requires that there be two vanishing points. So what's the difference? The main thing is that like a one-point perspective is really good for when you're looking at something straight on, right? Like a box straight on, or you're in the middle of a hallway and you're looking down the hallway and you have one vanishing point going away from you. But when you're at a catty corner to things, like this person sitting at this hallway at an angle, or when you're looking at a box where the corner is the thing that's facing you, it's often easier to do that in a two-point perspective system. Now, there are ways to calculate, and you can actually kind of see a little bit of a hint of that right there. There are ways to calculate what a box would look like when it's at a corner in a one-point perspective system, but it is easier, much quicker to do it in a two-point perspective system. So here's an example that we have seen a number of times of a one-point perspective system at work, right? And all of these, right, all of these lines, all of these diagonals, they are all built into the perspective system. They are all going to a single vanishing point. There are only a small set of diagonals in this whole painting that are not going to that vanishing point, right? And that's because this box is off angle from everything else, right? All of these are going to the vanishing point, but that box is not. Now, figuring out how to draw a box like at a catty corner faithfully in a one-point perspective system is pretty difficult, but I think Raphael does a pretty good job. Here's an example of how extreme you can take perspective systems. This is a study that Thomas Eakins did for a painting he was going to make of these two friends of his who are scullers. I mean, they did competitive boat rowing, right? And so he's planning a painting, and he wanted to come up with a perspective system so he could map out the exact change of height and width of all of the waves as they went back towards the boat. So he designed this grid so that he could come up with a system to replicate that and keep it accurate. Eakins was a bit of a control freak. And here we have George Tooker, an American artist, one of my favorites from 1950s. A lot of his work was from the 40s, but this is one of his more famous pieces called The Subway. And it's you can see how he's using this kind of like distorted two-point perspective system. He's using it for psychological purposes to create this sense of both kind of like everything's continually repeating and going off in every direction, but at the same time everything seems really kind of closed and claustrophobic. It's pretty effective. Okay, here is an Ed Ruscha painting. That's how you say that last name, Ruscha, which is kind of I remember when I was like 35 when I learned that I'd been mispronouncing Ed Ruscha for half of my life. And anyway, that's how you say it. And here's a piece. It's a screen print with collage element added to it. But the main point I want to make is just how he's using a one-point perspective system Actually, no, it's really a two-point perspective system. Using the two-point perspective system um, to make it like a very kind of minimal and simple kind of geometric composition. So it basically just becomes one big giant compositional triangle, right? But it is in perspective. Now we're going to talk about some contemporary artists who kind of either explore or do things sort of based off of perspective systems. And there's three of them that I want to talk about, and I'm a fan of all three of these painters. First is Carla Klein, and I kind of picked this one to start with, in part because of its some of its connections or similarities to the Ed Ruscha print. And I just love her paintings. I love her mark making, her expressiveness, and her color palette is just really thoughtful. And I especially like a lot of the paintings she's done that are these sort of like views, potentially like views from an automobile. You can't quite tell what some of these distortions are from, um, but I think they're really, uh, really effective. And these can be quite large. The last time I was in New York City for our New York City field trip, there was a Carla Klein exhibition, and they had paintings somewhat similar to this one, and like in proportion and subject matter, and it was maybe about 9 feet wide. It's pretty large. So another artist who occasionally, now this is not such an important part of her work, this is more like kind of a side study of her work, but so for some of the work that Sarah Morris does, there are these kind of suggestions of these very abstract perspective systems in them. And I'm not exactly sure her process for these paintings that are based off of airports and other locations. I'm assuming that she must do some perspective drawings at the location, and then maybe also does color studies, like just takes photographs or whatever to get color samples, and then the paintings are sort of based off of that. That's kind of pairing of observations. But they are very interesting. I like them. And lastly, I wanted to talk about Julian Moretti, who's one of my favorite artists. And her exploration, she plays with like perspective where you can never quite tell where the perspective system is, like where the vanishing line is, how completely faithful the perspective system is to an actual functioning linear perspective. There are many marks that seem to be going way off from perspective, but the illusion of space in these abstractions is so exciting and so, for me, very compelling. Like that, you really feel like a believable sense of certain shapes, certain marks are really coming forward, and other shapes and other marks are really pushing back. And there's this play with that all the way through. Here's another one of her pieces. This one is less tied to any kind of perspective system, but still has a huge amount of space. And I think her work is just really exciting. And these are very large pieces, by the way. And then here, oh, no, that was the last one. I thought I had three for her. All right, well, that is the end of the lecture. The next part for Unit 7 will be a discussion of the art impulse, the study impulse, and then after that, Unit 8. All right, see you then.